Hello, folks. Today is August 7th, 2018. This is the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting. And I'll start walking through the agenda in just a second here. So just as a PSA for the first part, before I get into the details, is the charter's been submitted for SIG cluster lifecycle, and I think we're just waiting for feedback from Brian. Otherwise, we've done one quick turn on some initial feedback, and then I'll batch everything else up and wait for Brian's feedback before I do the next update. The first topic that I added to the list for today was the multi-arch manifest issue. And the reason I kind of pushed back on this particular PR, which I think one of the VMware folks was working on, is that we don't have this stuff documented because there's multiple consumers of both kubeadm and as well as the testing artifacts. Like, we need to have a document that has a planned migration, because it's almost like implied semantics. So if we were to change this and nix the minus arch for all the different images, we would actually come into a bunch of problems from the community, because the people have a ton of automation around this. So I'll pause there for a second and see what folks have to say.
I was going to ask if we have a location for such a document to be defined, like globally across the project.
I think a KEP seems reasonable for this because it's the innards, but it is presented to the user eventually, but indirectly. I don't know. What do you think, Robert?
Have we exposed like any sort of contract for what these images are going to be, or do we sort of treat this as an implementation detail? And if people are relying on it today as part of the migration plan, would it make sense to turn it into either a contract we're going to stick to, or explicitly make it an implementation detail and tell people not to depend upon it because they might change again in the future?
Like a bunch of stuff.
A risky thing to do, to depend upon the specific image names, because the image names themselves are going to change every time, right?
The image names, not typically.
Well, do they have versions attached to them?
The tag will change, but the name doesn't change. Yeah.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
But it's one of those things where, like, we have this implicit contract versus having an explicit contract. And people do depend upon some implicit behavior, which is kind of common among stuff like this. So I'm totally fine with somebody writing up a doc and getting a proposal in place and making this go. Just making sure that we don't, like, if somebody's got all this automation built up for pulling images and getting other stuff ready, we don't just break a ton of people, because kubeadm is now the back end for a bunch of different installation folks. And that's the last thing I want to do.
Do we have automation that we maintain that pulls the existing images down for people to do offline installs? I think there's been some chatter in Slack about that the last couple of days. Presumably we would keep that up to date. So if people were using our automation for image pulling, it'd be fine. It's just that if people had built their own, it would be a problem, right?
Yes. So we added that in 1.11, right? But that's a recent add for 1.11.
So can you give you an example, like how this is going to break in terms of the other folks' automation? Because obviously we are not going to break it on the kubeadm side, I think.
So we added the image pulling in 1.11. So previously, before that, if people were doing sort of air-gapped installation processes, they would typically do their own image pull and list down the listing of the images with the tags specifically for those versions. And they would include the arch for those tags. Like, if a person was doing automation for doing verification on ARM, they would do it that way, because they'd always add the ARM tag, right? So that was the typical modus operandi. I guess the one thing we should just call out to use this other tool, we also can do like a one-time pad for breaking and just make sure we document it.
One other question. So presumably the fat images there, I think what Lucas explained to me is that they're basically redirects where you don't actually pull down an image that's maybe 3 or 4x bigger. You just pull down the image for your specific architecture. But how does that work for the copying to a private registry? Does we'd have to update our automation to actually pull both the the manifest and all the individual images and copy that across, because otherwise this isn't going to work. You know, if you use your pull tool on an AMD machine, but then you're actually trying to run on ARM, you're not going to have that version of the manifest, right?
Yes, and that is a common pattern, right? People do air-gapped setups and configuration quite often.
Well, and the tricky part about that is if you're doing that, you need to basically build a new manifest as well, because the manifest actually links to the specific remote images.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Is the automation for copying things internally is going to be a lot trickier with the manifest list than it is with straight up images, right?
Exactly.
And we'd have to make sure we got that right. And you know, like Tim was saying, anybody else with automation is going to have to do something similar.
So
it's also complicated by the fact that some of the private registries out there don't support manifest lists either. So there's still potential breakage, even if we do get the sync tool right, that the target registry won't support the manifest lists.
yeah, so I put a hold on the PR, just basically saying like there's a bunch of issues here that are deeper than just this individual change that requires addressing. I think the proper thing to do maybe would to have a proposal that we can agree upon for how we want to do this and think about it in a little more detail before we execute on it.
I think if we want to go this direction, it would also be wise to sort of pre-announce and say, by the way, in version 1.13 or whatever with kubeadmin, this is going to be the new behavior, to give people, you know, maybe a 3-month or even 6-month sort of warning that it's coming.
I agree.
So I have a question here. So if the current behavior for pulling images is by applying an architectural suffix, by introducing manifest lists, I'm not sure how this is going to break for users, because they can still pull the original architecture specific image, I think, even if the manifest list exists.
I thought part of the proposal was to nix the architecture specific suffix and
But
have the
I
redirectors.
the image still exists in at least in the Google registry. It's just that we are now supporting the manifest lists, which abstract the architecture suffix. So if users right now have the architecture suffix, they can basically, I think that they can continue using the same like line of code basically.
I don't think that's entirely true. Usually the manifests, I haven't looked into the specifics from kubeadm, but from my work on Sonoboy, the manifests push to different repositories the native images, and then a manifest is pushed to the original repository that combines both of those images. So I think the pull process would become slightly different. I think the tool for pulling from the repository has to have awareness of the new manifest format, but I'm also not 100% sure on that. I haven't done a lot of research. But I don't think we can assume it would just work.
Yeah, I think in the case of the GCR repository at least, and Ben can confirm this, I think, is that we can continue using the arch suffix, and it's just going to work, I think.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Sorry, I must have misunderstood. I misunderstood your question.
The statement that was made earlier about like, I think we just need some language or document somewhere that outlines the details that we can reference people to, because the use case that Robert pointed out in the beginning, which was that if I'm working on AMD but I'm doing an air-gapped install for or I'm doing air-gapped install for ARM, and I do a local pre-pulling, that I'm pulling down the wrong images, right? So that user case scenario, as long as it's documented, that says that this is the default behavior and this override exists, then I think we are okay.
Yeah, we just need I don't know, the location of this, where should this be documented? Like we discussed this earlier, but I'm still not sure. Like, who should I talk to about this?
I think part of it will be in the issue, and then a part of it should be linked to the website. I think the portion that we have on the website that talks about the pre-stages for setup, I think should probably be a little bit more detailed. We kind of say this is an optional portion for pre-pulling, but I think we should almost have a section that talks about the details of what it means to pre-pull and why you would want to do it and what are the ramifications for A versus B.
Yeah, in terms of CubeADM, we do have a section where we talk about the images and architectures and stuff, about the pre-pulling specifically, except that we don't have like a global location where we don't have a global statement about Kubernetes about this. We don't have a doc for this.
There isn't a doc. I mean, in the ideal world, we'd have both, right? Like that says like, these are the images that are published. This is the contract from Kubernetes of what we're going to release, and this is how you consume it, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to post a message in the SIGDocs channel to see if I get a response about this.
I don't think they own it. I think release and testing own it, right? So I think release owns like, this is the artifacts and this is how we publish them, right? And this is how you can plan to consume them.
Yeah, but the SIGDocs, I guess, have to approve the location of such documents if it's going to exist eventually.
Yes, eventually, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I guess I'm going to ping some people in the SIGDocs channel and see if we're going to get a discussion going for this.
So that's the first item. Thanks for taking notes, by the way. The second topic is a little more, even more thornier. Flag overrides. We've long had a problem inside of kubeadm of having default config and then optional flag override parameters. The problem that exists is, I think, not necessarily that we don't want to, the idea that we don't want to do it. It's just the technology choice and how we go about doing it that is the conundrum. It's very unclean, for lack of a better word or term, and not systematic of how it's done inside of the code if we were going to do flag overrides. And there are other tools that may be cleaner, or there's other policies we can approach here. So I wanted to have a conversation about how we want to broach this topic in general, because it will ripple across all this other component config work that, the proposal that we want to have a unified way of how we deal with, give me a config, use these flag overrides, and have a unified technology choice eventually for these other pieces, because we don't want to have kubeadm behave weirdly different than the kubelet behave weirdly different than the proxy. Now that's a global concern I have, but it doesn't mean that it'll stop us. I want to have a conversation more so than try to dictate things.
So I have a comment here. I kind of already made the comment in the issue. I think the kubelet did the right thing, even if it's like difficult to handle. And the idea is to eventually deprecate everything in terms of flags. Because without the override, we get chaotic behavior. If you look at the kubeproxy right now, the flags in config are mutually exclusive, which is pretty bad. And if we follow in the steps of the kubelet, I think we can basically start slowly deprecating. But I'm open to other ideas, like you mentioned, different tools and stuff.
I don't like the idea of getting rid of flags altogether. It seems a lot like decreasing user experience for the purpose of making development easier. I think it makes a lot of sense for the kubelet to do it, because the number of times you invoke the kubelet by hand it's minimal. Like the standard usage of a kubelet is you set it up in a config file somewhere, you set it as a daemon, something like that. Nobody's running kubelet by hand. But kubeadm, on the other hand, is pretty much always invoked by hand. Almost nobody is running it as a daemon or anything like that because it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think requiring people to edit a config file for something that they're going to run maybe once or twice a year is too onerous. I agree that the more advanced options should go in a config file. And I think there are use cases where that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think having just a couple of basic flags that override a config file is still a good idea.
I agree with that sentiment. I think what I have problems with the current PR is kind of the technological solutions. Now, there's many opinions about Viper, but Viper solves this problem cleanly, and it has this explicit ordering, of config through config env flags, right? So that way you have, now we don't need to use Viper, we could use some other technology that we could rally on, but that doesn't exist inside of the Kubernetes code base, right? The Kubernetes code base has every combination of oddities that exist between those different ways to pass parameters. So I would like, as sort of the folks who have submitted the proposals for unification of config, to start to formulate an opinion, for better or for worse, about rallying around this standard practice.
I think I agree with Liz, and we should maybe look at the similarities between kubeadmin and kubectl and say that we want the experience of the tools we expect humans to run directly to be consistent, and not necessarily consistent with binaries that are run as part of the cluster itself, right? So trying to compare kubeadmin to kubelet is not the right comparison. We should compare it to kubectl. And maybe we should be comparing kubelet to the API server or the controller manager and trying to make those consistent. We sort of had two groups of things we want to have consistency around. One is system components that we never expect people to run, and the other is things we expect people to interact with. So I don't know if does the kubelet, I know it takes lots of different flags. You can point to different places. You can set environment variables. Maybe we should be talking to SIG-CLI and see if there's any sort of coherent plan around where that is or where it's going, and try to align with them instead of trying to align with the component configuration plan, which is something we are also pushing, but is not necessarily the same user experience.
I like that idea. Liz?
So,
go ahead, Jason. Did you talk?
I was going to say the original component config proposal was supposed to prioritize command line arguments above the config file as well. That was something that I asked specifically about when we first hit the kube proxy config issue. So the current behavior where the config file is overriding the command line arguments appears to be an actual bug and not the way the implementation was supposed to be handled originally.
So the problem with flags, I'm going to mention this, I've seen discussions around SIG-CLI about kubectl. I mean, they have problems with flags. They have too many flags, and flags are difficult to maintain. And they are, like Michael Taufen is saying, they do not hold a version. So, I mean, that's part of the bigger picture, like the problem with flags and how to maintain them. But I do agree that if you use flags from the command line with kubeadm, it's much easier, definitely. But I think we should still consider, I don't know, perhaps deprecating the flags that are cost related, those for kubeadm init and join, and leave those that are for tooling, like generating certificates and for the config.
I definitely think there are some things we should deprecate. I think the thing we really need is a policy on what gets a config flag and what gets stuck in the configuration file. Dash help is completely useless. But I also don't think that we want to end up in the situation where you have to write out a config file before even initially. You can get most of a working cluster out of kubeadm in it with no arguments is a very powerful thing. And I don't think we should get rid of that. I think we need a policy about what is a flag and what is a config variable instead of making all of those decisions ad hoc.
That is a great point. Liz, are you interested in trying to start crafting such a policy?
Am I allowed to say no?
Sure.
I don't know how I would go about doing it, but I guess I'm one of the people involved in the configuration thing, so I can certainly take a shot at it.
Yeah, it sounds like something that you're passionate about, so that is often a good motivator for making progress.
Yeah, I do think some rallying point of conversation would be helpful, whether it be proposal or some individual document before it gets to proposal form that says, like, here's the problem statement, here are some proposed ideas of how we want to address it, and some technological choices that exist and the trade-offs between them. Because this is a meta problem, right?
Perhaps we should also address like SIG architecture, like about the general idea about our approach.
Well, step one, get a doc to talk about with them, and then step two, talk about them with the doc, about the doc.
I'm definitely in favor of drawing upon the other resources. There's a bit, Kubernetes is definitely a living representation of Conway's Law, and I think we should fight that at every opportunity that we can.
You almost made me spit out my tea, Liz.
Okay, so I think everyone seems to be in agreement that we would like to have a clear policy around what's a flag, what's a config file, that we want to not have too large of a proliferation of flags, but that we also would ideally not like to require a configuration file for at least a streamlined getting started experience. Now, if you start veering off of sort of the golden path, you're probably going to end up in a config file very quickly because of point number one of not wanting too many flags. I guess so. The question is, where did that leave us on this particular pull request, and how can we move this conversation forward? I don't know if the author of the PR is on the call. He's from Bulgaria, so probably not.
No, he's away today.
Okay. I just don't want to have the conversation make the PR stagnant, and we need to sort of have some clarity for the PR author of what we would like to what we'd like to see changed before it can move forward.
We definitely don't want to be in the situation where somebody submits a PR and it's their first PR, and everybody in the project decides that now is the time to have a super important architectural debate about it. So I think I would lean towards getting their thing merged now, as long as it's not, completely heinous. I don't have a lot of background on this particular PR. I don't know what we're referring to, but just like in general, I don't want the pattern of blocking somebody's PR for 6 months while we bite shed, especially if they're a relatively new contributor.
I agree. That's why I was trying to figure out what the path forward was. And the path forward could be, we need a design, or we need some more context, or we need something else, like not just merge code we don't want to maintain forever. I think that's the other thing we need to be careful with is, maybe we should set expectations that if you just come by and send a large PR, that's not going to be a successful way to start contributing. You should, write a doc about what you're trying to do, or you should come talk to the SIG first, and you'll have a much smoother process.
Well, I think he tried to solve a specific problem, but it has much broader implications. And we don't have a unified policy yet, right? It's just a shame. We probably should have had a unified policy eons ago, but feature.
I think there's some ex post facto here. Like, I think making a rule about in response to this PR and then subjecting this PR to that rule that we made is probably not particularly fair. So I think we should try to get this merged and use it as a reference point for a policy in the future, just to be respectful of this person's time and energy.
Hi, Lucas. What do you think about the flag overriding the config by default?
So I think it's a useful feature, and I thought earlier when talking to Mike Toffen, I thought this would be the way we do stuff for other components configs. That in the migration from only flags to config plus flags would have higher priority than config, and most of the config, or like eventually in like cube v2 or whatever, we would actually be able to get rid of most of the flags and only use config for most of the stuff. So that was that's what it says in the doc, like the how you do component config kind of official doc at the moment. If we intend to change that policy, which I wasn't aware of, and I've been like focusing on this stuff anyway, so I don't know. I think it's okay for Kubernetes to do this, and I just guess that people were a bit scared of the complexity it adds, and to this,
Well,
I think I had time to actually look at how complex it is.
I think this is only one flag, and it proliferates. And I think the idea that for the other flags and have a unified policy for Kubernetes would require a lot more changes and be unwieldy. And I think the stopping point for me, that a comment that I made is like, I'm torn by this. I understand what you're trying to do and solve, but things like Viper solve this problem in a much cleaner, more general way. And I think I think Liz has made a point, like we should unblock this thing and start to strive towards having a policy is probably the reasonable approach, right? It's the happy medium.
What did you link in the JSON? Is it related to this or?
Yeah, well, in a way, it was brought to my attention that the kube proxy implementation right now, which we thought the command line arguments override the config file, that's not currently how it behaves in practice right now.
Oh yeah, I know that, and I see it as a problem, and that's why I'm working on getting the components config stuff better. Yeah, so that's exactly the kind of problem we as a community need to solve in some way. Like, and it also is this thing with instance specific, like, should instance specific stuff have its own config file, or should it only exist as flags or whatever? So yeah, I think it's if I'm personally okay with this, and I kind of want this as well. Like the exact code might have to be rewritten a little or like polished, but But yeah, fine by me at least. I plus want making a policy more general.
Maybe we should move to the next topic. Thanks, Lucas.
I'm writing up a issue in the Kubedium repo right now about making this policy. I will add it to the meeting minutes once I've posted it.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
There's just one, I think the next topic was the log file. It was originally called this, I think I said something in a conversation and then it was logged in the issue as a Sentinel file, but it's just a log for what Kubedium does for the different operations. I want to unblock that PR because again, I was reviewing PRs this weekend. So I want to get that unblocked for the person, but I know that Lubomir, you had conversed to try and get that moving.
Yeah, so it's partially our fault because we had a discussion with Chuck about it and you, Tim, that this should be called a Sentinel file, but it's more like a Sentinel file. It's not exactly a Sentinel file. So I went with the same name, and I think this is just wrong. Maybe we should change it. But I guess the question here is, if it's not going to be named a Sentinel file, how are we going to name it?
I think just a kubedium.log file seems fine. And it's basically a log of the operations of how somebody used Kubedium. I think it's useful for some people who file issues to be able to submit that log file as the canonical list of things they did, because sometimes when they log issues, they've done everything they can think of. And by the time they log the issue, we don't know the set of parameters that's actually been specified. We only get a subset of the information that's there. So it's useful for diagnostic purposes to say, and we can even put it as part of the default submission, you copy this file, which is your Kubedium log file that tells us like, this is what you have done on this machine to get you into this state.
So another related question here, which also goes back to the flags discussion from earlier. Do we want to, are we okay with logging sensitive flags into the walk?
What flags do you consider sensitive?
I mean, IP addresses that people don't want everybody to know, like they should then hide it if they share the log with us.
I think.
What about think about the token join flags with the secrets in them, or the various command line like you can specify a bootstrap secret to Kubedium in it, and that's something you probably wouldn't want shared. If you something like extra SAN API args, I often add what's it called? The host name of the Amazon node that I'm using. I probably don't want that just like sitting in a GitHub issue. So I think there are definitely things that we would want to sanitize, and we'd have to come up with a good framework for doing that.
Well, you can also explicitly specify, because when people post logs, which is part of the submission template, they typically sanitize the logs of the information that they care about. And those logs do contain, IP address information as well as host endpoint information, a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, that's true. It's possible. Maybe we could have just like a scrubber or something that they could use that removes that information from log files. But I think asking users to do it themselves is an undue burden, especially if, like you said, Tim, they've run 2 or 3 dozen commands trying to figure out what actually works. And how many times have you seen somebody post their private key on GitHub because they didn't quite know what they're doing and we're trying to get help troubleshooting something? So
I guess the stepping back, should we enable this feature? Like we talked about it and somebody just went ahead and did it, but it wasn't really prioritized to be like, this would be like one of the nice things to have. I do think it's useful for diagnostics, and almost every single other, as we talked a couple weeks ago about it, almost every single other sort of configuration management utility has some type of log trace facility. right? I think that would be useful for users to be able to diagnose. Or we could put some information inside of the kubeadm log output, which is another option. So like kubeadm could have like the explicit args, with some sanitize, we could sanitize the input, and then they could just copy paste that kubeadm output directly.
I wonder if we couldn't I think you can specify extra attributes for flags with Cobra, Viper, whatever. I'm wondering if we could just come up with some way to flag certain flags as, come up with a way to mark certain flags as being sensitive and just, output them into the logs as Hunter2 or whatever. I think this is I think Tim is right. This is a good solution. And I think that sanitizing the log file is not an intractable problem.
Something else about this kubeadm log file. So some commands require sudo access. So if you write to the log file, you're writing sensitive data also to the log file, but then should we basically make this file accessible to everyone? Like everybody outside of root, can they still see the log file?
No. If you're doing sudo, we should, maintain the ACLs and the write privileges to be just root level.
Yeah, so this basically complicates the situation because we need a couple of log files, one for sudo and one for without sudo.
I don't think I totally agree that the sudo should have a different log file. Commands you run with sudo still end up in .bash history. And what we're proposing is basically a narrower version of .bash history. So I don't think there's any problem with having them be accessible to...
But users outside of root cannot see this particular bash history, right?
No, because if you execute a command with sudo, it still shows up in the user who's executed its bash history. The output doesn't, but the fact that you executed a command with sudo with all of the arguments does, unless you put a space in front of it or something.
Yeah, so we should probably just write everything to the log file in that case. And everybody should have access to it, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think a whole lot about deploying kubeadm in a multi-user environment. I suspect that doesn't happen very often, but I'm not a product person. I don't actually know.
Yeah, I think we can just go with the original proposal, but rename the Sentinel file to kubeadm log file. And is there anything else that I have to instruct the PR submitter about this?
I think we could definitely add log file sanitization post hoc. I don't think there's any reason that we have to impose this on this particular user.
Oh, so it's like a filtering or?
No, just one of us can write that feature and we will, we can merge this PR now and then somebody else can write the filter. If we don't get the filter written, then the onus is on the user to sanitize their file, which is not ideal, but I think it's still a step in the right direction, and we can try to get this sanitization done.
Yeah, it's nice to have. It's lower priority, but we can get this eventually working as well.
Yeah, that's exactly how I think about it.
Any other points on this one? Or should we move on? Robert, I think you're on for the next one. It says test for 112 alpha.
Yeah, I put this on here last week because right before the meeting, I was getting pinged about test failures. And I was just looking at test grid and I can't find anything under SIG release with 1.12 tests. So I assume that they're just the master tests at this point. the master branch we're calling 1.12 alpha. And there were some tests on master blocking that people were pinging me about. I can't remember if they've been fixed since last week. I haven't checked this morning.
Yeah, we have everything fixed. I submitted a couple of PRs, and also I pinged a bunch of people from GCP SQL provider to help with some other work. And I think everything is green. We only have one flaky test in the release blocking. And I think Tim Pepper is here. He can probably give more details about release blocking stuff.
Yeah, that's correct. I think from y'all's perspective, things look fine at this point on master. And the 1.12 branch won't be created until next week, so it is just master at this point. And once the branch is created, then you'll have the branch-specific CI.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And again, this was a thing last week. It looked like there was some stuff we could discuss because it was happening right before the meeting, but it sounds like it's been taken care of. So thanks, Lubomir, and we can probably just move on to the next agenda.
I was hoping here that we can talk with Dims about all the end-to-end tests related to multi-architecture support. He's doing a lot of work right now, but yeah, it was nice to have a discussion about it as well. Is Ben here still? Yeah, Ben. Yeah. Do you have any idea about like the work Dims is doing right now? What's the status of that in terms of multi-architecture?
I don't know about any multi-architecture testing efforts at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay. Here is Dims. Hi.
So the work so far has been around making sure that our end-to-end testing and all the other pieces that we have are able to support the architectures, right? So that's the first step. Previously, there were teams working on S390 and Power, which had hit some roadblocks. So we are at a point where we are unblocking that work. So now we have to go back to those teams and tell them, look, we are ready now. You can start trying as well. So there are 3 teams that I know of. One from IBM, it's S390 and PowerPC. Those are the 2 teams that are interested. And then from ARM, there's a few people who have been trying to use Sonoboy with ARM. So we can hopefully get some people who are interested in ARM as well from there. So those are the 3 architectures that I know of for sure. That there are people who are interested in trying things out. But what I don't know is how much they are willing to work on setting up the CI system and then publishing results to testbed. So yeah, so that, and once we have that in place, then we can go to the release team and like officially make them release blocking and things like that. So at this point, let's get the base infrastructure ready, and then it's up to people who come to do the work. That's where we are right now. We are almost there. We have 4 PRs that are open right now, where we have to push the container images, and then we have to fix any bugs that show up from that. And after that, we are good. I'm hoping to get this work done this week. So basically, we'll have a full set of end-to-end images that are multi-arc capable. But then when somebody actually tries it, then we'll know if there are any bugs in there.
Yeah, or they're basically going to hit a CNI issue or something like that, which
exactly
doesn't have a fat manifest. Yeah.
Right. Or they might see like a stray binary somewhere, which is still AMD 64, and then we have to go, find out where the source is. So we have a manifest.go. The first attempt is to make sure that all the things that are listed there are supporting multi-arc stuff. Also, the related thing here is the Cube API server and container. There are container images in the CI system. Those are actually multi-arc at this point. What is not multi-arc is the images that we push out that are used by end users when we do a milestone or a final release. So that PR is still pending. I'm hoping to get some people to look at that. That's been pending for a while now. But I don't want to mess with any of the releases that are going on now in 111 branch or 110 branch or anything like that. So I'm holding off till we know that our base is solid before we actually push that out. And that we might actually hold off on that part maybe till the end of this release or towards the end of this release. But we'll figure that out. That's my update.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So the last item, it's not the last item. Basically, George Castro went to the Sequence Lifecycle channel and he said that they have a project called Kubernetes Jobs. I mean, they're probably going to change this to be called something else, to my understanding, because jobs is not the right word after some discussions. But the idea here is that if a SIG has an offer for the public to help, we can basically create like a little job description, like we need people to help with testing or with documentation writing, and we can post this on a forum that is still work in progress. So if anybody has any ideas, I guess I'm going to share a document about this in an issue, and everybody can contribute in Google Docs if we have any ideas. Does anybody have comments about this?
I think it would be great if we could, maybe at some point during the KubeADM office hours for KubeADM specific stuff, or even Cluster API, could do separate individual things of where they would want help. And I think following up on it would be really useful, because there are definite areas that I think are languishing that it would be nice if folks who are interested in contributing and want to get involved to have that well-defined and scoped for them to just be able to engage.
So are you available tomorrow, Tim? We can have a discussion tomorrow.
We can add it to the office hours agenda for tomorrow, sure.
Okay.
I think the last thing on the agenda for today is I want to do a quick PSA that we sent an email to the list with regards to the Cluster API, the AWS implementation for Cluster API. We spec'd out the repo and we want to start implementing, and I know there's a broader coalition of folks who are interested in getting involved. I'll send out an invite. I was thinking about for the afternoon. No one has said that this time doesn't work. I saw you unmute, David. So if you're interested, please respond to that thread and we'll try to set the time appropriately. But I was thinking tomorrow afternoon makes a lot of sense to just start to hash out some of the requirements that folks have.
I just had one question. There's currently one issue and one PR in the repo.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, and there's also a design doc, which is not linked anywhere in the repo anyway. I wondered if there's any other background information people might want to have before that meeting.
Just come with your laundry list of things that you want, right? And then we'll try to distill that down and break it down into a series of action items that we can start to execute against. Are there any other topics that folks want to discuss?
Tim, I think you mentioned something at the very beginning about the charter, which is what we spent last week working on. Do you want to, for people that may have missed the beginning, I came in, I think, halfway through that. Do you want to give a quick update since we have a few minutes left? I saw that Brian left a bunch of comments yesterday.
Oh, I didn't see that yet.
Okay. I don't know if we wanted to go through those as a group, or if I think some of them seemed easy to fix and some of them may or may not require discussion.
I haven't taken a look yet on Brian's comments, so I have not seen it yet. I haven't triaged the backlog, so I think I could probably fix the ones that are easy to fix, and maybe loop in other folks who are already on the issue. I think everyone who had partaked in the major points of creating the doc are actually already looped in on the issue. So I don't know if we need to discuss broader things with the group right now unless there's something contentious. I haven't looked yet, so I don't know.
Well, we have 8 minutes if you want to discuss it right now.
I can pull up the doc here.
Possibly share your screen if you want.
Sure, 1 second.
I mean, I saw the feedback from yesterday. I don't see anything that dramatic or anything.
Should we say user experience instead of UX to avoid jargon? I see the scope section below, but I prefer to make this more specific if possible. There are aspects of user experience. Many tasks involve cluster administration. I think this is just vernacular or more language. Knit, that's easy to do. Easy to do. That doesn't seem contentious. Well, this is Brian, so.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff.
I mean, this sentence we kind of wordsmithed, so.
I think that it's a copy paste from another document. Actually, I think Robert can confirm that.
It is. It is.
Yeah, I think it's copy paste from maybe Justin's document, and then we added the last little bit there.
It is. That's fine. I think I need to go through it in more detail. I don't know if there's major things. Sometimes some things will just be Brian, because that's how he rolls. But I'll push it back on him and be like, "What phrasing do you suggest?"
Well, he put suggested phrasing right there, right?
How about? Yeah, but it's beyond that scope, right? That's the whole purpose of this relevant infrastructure, clusters and their components, because it's, I don't know if that includes this or not. Well, whatever. At this point, I'm not going to bike shed on vernacular. I think what I'll do is I'll need to go through this and update the PR, and I'll loop in folks for one more round of reviews. How's that sound?
Yeah, I think most of it's very easy to fix, and that's what I was saying. I think there might be a couple of things that are worth discussing. We probably can't pluck it out in the next 2 minutes and have a useful discussion about it, though. Yeah.
If there are things that you think are worth discussing in the broader context, please chime in on the PR. It's community PR number 2456. I'll paste it inside the Slack channel too as well.
Okay, and then assuming nothing contentious that we wanted to discuss during this meeting, people should look at the PR, and if we can get another round of feedback, we'll try to get it merged before next week, hopefully.
Sounds good. Any other last topics with the whole 2 minutes and some odd seconds? Going once, twice. Fabrizio, yes.
Hi. One question about multi-arc. When we are talking about multi-arc, we are talking about architecture in cluster in architecture different than AMD, or we are talking about cluster with mixed architecture, so one node AMD, one node ARM, and so on.
We generally do not, as a community, have not put a position on heterogeneous clusters. Usually the clusters deployments have been homogeneous. So it's about pulling on one and deploying on another.
Hi.
Because there was a issue with a user complaining that with a cluster mixed with mixed architecture, so one node ARM and another AMD, and trying to help this user, I saw that not only kubeadmin needs to move on fatty images, but also CNI provider, for instance. So it is fine. I think that the more appropriate answer to this issue is that as a community, we are not supporting this. And to make this to work, you need to customize a lot of things manually.
Right. So I think the first thing that we'll target is making sure that ARM only cluster will fully work. For example, Power cluster by itself, where everything soup to nuts is Power, works fine. And then we will think about, the next step would be to think about the mixed clusters. But until we have CI systems for any of these, we cannot say that we support anything. It's up to them to figure out what works, what doesn't work. Currently, I'm told that PowerPC cluster works fine, so. But then I don't have the data to say, okay, it's still continuing to work because we don't have a CI system for it. So at this point, it's like, okay, we'll try to help you, but we can't really recreate the problem because we don't have a CI system.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
All right, with that, I think we've run out of time. So thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.